The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1882, addressed to Julia Maddox in handwriting so careful and deliberate that it looked almost like a printed document. And when she tore it open at the small kitchen table of her rented room above Hargrove's General Store in Dusty Creek, Colorado, she found inside a deed to a ranch she had never heard of, in a county she had barely visited, signed over to her in full, with no explanation beyond a single sentence written on a separate sheet of folded paper that read, "The land is yours now, take care of it." Julia read the sentence 3 times. Then she turned the paper over looking for more. There was nothing. She set it down on the table beside her cup of cooling coffee and looked out the window at the dry October street below, where 2 horses were tied to the post in front of the land office, and a woman was sweeping dust off her porch in a losing battle with the wind. Julia was 26 years old. She had $12.40 to her name, a sewing kit, a carpetbag with 2 dresses in it, and a mother who had died 8 months ago in Kansas City, leaving behind nothing but debts and a faded photograph on the mantel. She had come to Dusty Creek because she had a distant cousin there, a woman named Hattie, who had offered her a place to stay until Julia could find work. The work had come in the form of alterations and mending for the ladies of the town, but it was barely enough to pay her room rent to Clarence Hargrove, who was not an unkind man, but was not a charitable one either. She picked up the deed again and read the name at the top. The property was called the Keller Creek Ranch, located in Holt County, some 40 miles east of Dusty Creek, and it encompassed, according to the legal description, 680 acres of grassland, a main house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, and water rights to a creek running along the southern boundary. The deed was signed by a notary public in the town of Millhaven and dated September 12, 1882. The previous owner, according to the document, was one Thomas Keller, deceased. Julia did not know any Thomas Keller. She had never heard the name. She turned back to the single sheet with the handwritten note and examined the signature at the bottom, which she had initially overlooked in her confusion. It was initialed only, T.K. Thomas Keller then. A dead man had given her a ranch she had never seen, in a county she barely knew, with no explanation other than 6 words and a period. She was certain it was a mistake. Someone had written the wrong name on the deed, or the wrong address on the envelope, or perhaps there was another Julia Maddox somewhere in Colorado who was meant to receive this, and was even now wondering why nothing had arrived. The logical thing, the only sensible thing, was to find out who had sent it and return it to its rightful owner. Julia folded the deed carefully, tucked it back into the envelope, pinned on her brown wool coat, and walked down the stairs and 3 blocks to the land office on Main Street. The land agent, a thin man named Mr. Pryor, with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, examined the deed for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at her over the rim of his glasses and said that the document appeared to be entirely legitimate. The notary seal was genuine. The legal description was consistent with county records for Holt County. Julia Maddox was, as far as the deed indicated, the lawful owner of the Keller Creek Ranch. She asked him if there had been any mistake. He said he couldn't tell her that. She asked him who Thomas Keller was. He said he didn't know the man personally, but that the ranch had been a Keller family property for nearly 20 years, and that Thomas Keller had filed the deed transfer some weeks before his death. She asked how Thomas Keller had died. Pryor said he didn't have that information and suggested she ride out to Millhaven if she wanted answers, since that was the county seat for Holt County and would have the relevant records. Julia thanked him and walked back out into the cold October air and stood on the plank sidewalk with the envelope pressed against her chest and the wind pulling at her coat collar. She had never felt so confused and so oddly hopeful at the same time, and she was not sure which of those feelings frightened her more. She talked it over with Hattie that evening, sitting in Hattie's small parlor while the lamp threw warm shadows on the walls and the smell of wood smoke drifted in from the fireplace. Hattie was a round-faced, practical woman of 32 who had been married to a blacksmith for 6 years and had two small children who were already asleep in the back room. She looked at the deed for a long time, turned it over, handed it back, and said, "Well, Julia, even if it is a mistake, you ought to find out before you give it back. Because if it isn't a mistake, you're sitting on the most valuable thing you've ever owned." Julia said she didn't want to travel 40 miles on the strength of a mystery. Hattie said that 40 miles was nothing, and that the alternative was spending the winter doing mending work for ladies who paid her in bolts of calico that she couldn't eat. Then Hattie's husband, a broad-shouldered man named Frank, came in from the kitchen with a mug of coffee and said that he knew a reliable man running a wagon freight route that passed through Millhaven twice a week, and that he could arrange passage for Julia for practically nothing if she helped the freighter's wife with some sewing in exchange. Julia looked at the deed again, at her own name written in a dead man's hand, and said all right. She would go. She arrived in Millhaven 3 days later on a cold Thursday afternoon, seated beside the freighter's wife on the buckboard of a covered wagon that smelled of flour and leather. Millhaven was a modest but established town with a courthouse, 2 hotels, a church, a sheriff's office, a doctor's practice, a school, and several businesses along a wide main street. The mountains were visible to the west, blue and enormous in the distance, and the grassland that surrounded the town was the amber color of late autumn, rolling gently toward the horizon in every direction. Julia paid for a room at the smaller of the 2 hotels, a clean establishment called the Millhaven House, run by a widow named Mrs. Oakes, who was friendly and businesslike, and showed Julia to a room on the 2nd floor with a view of the street. In the morning, Julia went to the county clerk's office and asked to see the records pertaining to Thomas Keller's estate and the transfer of the Keller Creek Ranch. The clerk, a young man with a careful disposition, found the files without difficulty. Thomas Keller had been 64 years old when he died in August of 1882 of a heart ailment that had plagued him for several years. He had no wife, as his wife, Margaret, had died in 1871. He had one son, Daniel Keller, aged 28, who had been living and working on the ranch with his father up until Thomas's death. The deed transfer to Julia Maddox had been filed and notarized in early September, roughly 3 weeks after Thomas Keller's death, which meant that the transfer had been prepared before Thomas died, since the notarization had to have been done while the man was still living and competent. Julia asked the clerk if there was any record of a Julia Maddox having a connection to the Keller family. The clerk looked through additional files and found nothing. No contract, no letter of intent, no legal agreement that explained the transfer. She thanked him and stood in the hallway of the courthouse for a moment, thinking. Then she asked the clerk if he knew where Daniel Keller could be found, and the clerk said that Daniel Keller was generally on the ranch, which was about 12 miles east of Millhaven, but that he came into town on Fridays to collect supplies and his mail, and this being Thursday, he would very likely be in town tomorrow morning. Julia decided to wait. She went back to the hotel, had supper in the small dining room, and lay awake for a long time that night listening to the wind move through the eaves and wondering what kind of man Daniel Keller was, and whether he knew about his father's strange decision, and whether he was angry about it, or perhaps it was all some error in paperwork that had not yet been discovered. She was downstairs eating breakfast at 7:30 the next morning when Mrs. Oakes, who was refilling the coffee pot, said casually that Daniel Keller's wagon had just pulled up outside, as he always stopped at the hotel for coffee before his other errands. Julia set down her fork. "Mrs. Oakes gave her a look that was part curiosity and part kindness and said, "He is a good man, dear, in case you were wondering, not the kind that makes trouble." The door opened 2 minutes later, letting in a gust of cold air and Daniel Keller. He was tall, broad-shouldered without being heavy, with dark brown hair that was somewhat wind-disordered beneath his hat, and a face that would have been handsome in a conventional sense, except that it had something more interesting than conventional handsomeness, a quality of steadiness and directness in the dark eyes, and a mouth that looked as though it was comfortable with silence but not unfamiliar with warmth. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat over a flannel shirt, dusty boots, and worn leather gloves that he pulled off and tucked into his coat pocket when he came inside. He looked to be, as the clerk had said, in his late 20s. He nodded to Mrs. Oakes, who poured him a cup without being asked, and then he noticed Julia at the corner table and gave her a brief, polite nod before hanging his hat on the hook by the door and sitting down at the counter. Julia did not know how to start the conversation. She sat for a moment longer, arranging words in her head, and then gave up on arranging them and just stood up and walked to the counter. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Daniel Keller?" He turned to look at her properly then, and she noticed that his eyes were a deep, quiet brown, the color of creek water in late afternoon. "I am," he said. "My name is Julia Maddox," she said. "I believe your father may have sent me something that belongs to you." The expression that moved across his face was complicated. It was not surprise exactly. It was something more layered than that, something that included recognition and a kind of careful stillness, as though he had been expecting this but had not known exactly when it would happen. He looked at her for a moment, then said, "Will you sit down, Miss Maddox?" She sat on the stool beside him and placed the envelope with the deed on the counter between them. He looked at it but did not touch it. "You've come to return it," he said. It was not quite a question. "I've come to find out if it was a mistake," she said. "I don't know your father. I never met him in my life. I don't know why he would give me a ranch." Daniel Keller picked up the envelope and held it for a moment, and something crossed his face that might have been grief, quieted down to something bearable. "My father was not a man who made mistakes with paperwork," he said. "He was deliberate about everything. If he signed this over to you, it was because he meant to." "But why?" Julia said, "I don't understand. I am a stranger to him." Daniel was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "Were you acquainted with a woman named Margaret Maddox, perhaps a relative?" Julia felt something shift in her chest. "Margaret Maddox was my mother's sister," she said slowly. "My aunt. She died years ago, before I was born, actually. I only know of her from what my mother told me." Daniel nodded, very slowly, as though something had just settled into place that had been unsettled for a long time. "Margaret Maddox was my mother before she married my father," he said. "Her name was Margaret Maddox Keller." Julia stared at him. The dining room was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of the wind outside. "Your mother," she said. "Yes." He set the envelope down on the counter. "My father never stopped feeling that he had taken her away from her family. She came from Kansas City. Her family did not approve of the move west, and there was a falling out, and she died in 1871 and was never reconciled with them. My father lived with that for 11 years. He paused. "I think he found out you were living in Colorado through some inquiries he made before he died. And I think giving you the ranch was his way of making it right, or as right as he could make it, for my mother's family." Julia looked down at the envelope on the counter. She could feel the weight of the thing differently now, not as a random mistake but as the final gesture of a dying man's conscience, reaching across the years and the miles to make good on something that had gone wrong before she was even born. The feeling in her chest was too full for easy naming. "The ranch was always going to be mine, was it?" she said finally, not meaning to say it aloud. "I think," Daniel said carefully, "that my father believed that. Yes." She looked up at him. "And what do you believe?" He held her gaze for a long moment, steady and direct. "I think you ought to come and see it," he said, "before you decide anything." She should have said no. She should have said she needed time to think, that she needed to consult someone, that she needed to understand the legal situation better before she made any decisions. Instead, she said, "All right." He picked up his coffee cup, finished it, and placed a coin on the counter. Mrs. Oakes collected it without comment but gave Julia a small, private smile as she passed that said, quite clearly, "I told you he was a good man." They rode out to the ranch that same morning in Daniel's wagon, which carried a load of supplies bound for the property. The road east of Millhaven was a well-worn two-track through grassland that was golden and still in the autumn morning, and the sky above was a deep, clean blue with long white clouds moving across it from the northwest. Julia sat beside Daniel on the wagon seat and they talked carefully, the way two people talk when they are both aware that the conversation could go in several directions, and neither of them is sure yet which one it will take. He told her about the ranch. It had been built by his father in 1864, the year Daniel was born, when Thomas Keller had come west from Ohio with a young wife and a belief that there was land to be had if a man was willing to work for it. He had been right. The land was honest and Thomas had been a thorough man, and over nearly 20 years the ranch had grown from a claim with a one-room soddy into a working cattle operation with a proper house and several hundred head of longhorns. Daniel had grown up on the land, had learned everything on it, and had worked it alongside his father since he was old enough to hold a fence post. Julia told him about her life in Kansas City, the years of careful, narrow circumstance after her father had died, her mother's small income from taking in boarders, the work Julia had learned as a seamstress and alteration maker, because it was respectable and required little initial investment, and the decision to come west after her mother's death, because staying in the city held nothing for her but grief and debt. She did not tell the story with self-pity, and he did not receive it with pity, which she appreciated more than she could say. When the ranch came into view, Julia understood immediately that it was beautiful in the way that working places are beautiful, not ornamental but honest. The main house was a solid, well-built structure of wood and stone, 2 stories, with a wide porch running across the front. The barn was large and well-maintained. The fences around the near pasture were straight and sound, and through the golden grass she could see the glitter of the creek along the southern property line. There was smoke coming from the house chimney, which puzzled her until Daniel explained that there were 2 ranch hands who lived on the property, brothers named Pete and Cal Yardley, who had worked for his father for years and had stayed on after his death. They pulled the wagon up to the house, and a dog came out to greet them, a big ranch dog with a brown and white coat and a confident manner that communicated it was glad to see Daniel and was reserving judgment on Julia. Daniel climbed down and reached a hand up to help her, and she took it, and the moment her boots touched the ground she felt something that she could not immediately explain, a sense of rightness, of solid earth beneath her, as though she had been waiting without knowing it to arrive at this particular spot. Pete Yardley came out of the barn, a stocky, sun-weathered man of about 40 with a bushy mustache and a friendly squint. Daniel introduced her, explaining in brief terms who she was and why she was there. Pete looked at her for a moment, then looked at Daniel, then looked back at her and said, "Well, the old man always did know what he was doing," which Julia did not entirely understand but which seemed to mean something to Daniel, who looked briefly away at the horizon. They went inside. The house was clean and simply furnished, with a large fireplace in the main room, a kitchen that was practical and well-equipped, and a staircase that led to 3 bedrooms on the upper floor. It smelled of wood smoke and leather, and something that might have been the ghost of a woman's presence, something careful in the arrangement of objects on the shelves, a set of china plates that no one had bothered to use in perhaps years, but that were arranged with an old deliberateness. Margaret Keller's presence was still faintly visible in the room if you knew to look for it. Julia stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly, looking at everything. Daniel stood by the fireplace and watched her with his arms folded and an expression that was carefully neutral but not uninvested. "Your father prepared this for me," she said. It was not quite a question. "He had the room on the 2nd floor at the end of the hall put in order," Daniel said. "Last spring, when he was still well enough to direct things, he had Pete whitewash the walls and bring in the proper furniture. He was very certain I would come. He was certain the deed would reach you," Daniel said. "He couldn't be certain you'd come. I think he hoped you would." She turned to face him. "And you," she said, "did you hope I would come?" The neutral expression shifted slightly, just slightly, into something warmer and more complicated. "I didn't know what to hope," he said honestly. "I knew he had done it, and I knew he was right to do it. Whether you came or not was your decision to make. But you're not angry," she said, and it was almost an accusation because she was trying to understand him. "He gave away the ranch, your ranch, the thing you've worked your whole life for, and you're not angry." Daniel looked at her for a moment. "He didn't give it away," he said quietly. "He gave it to family." Julia felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She turned back to the room because she needed a moment that he couldn't see, and she looked at the china plates on the shelf and thought about the aunt she had never known, who had been Margaret Maddox before she became Margaret Keller, who had come west and been cut off from her family and died young and left a son who was still here, tending the land she had helped to build. She stayed for 3 days. It was Daniel who proposed it, carefully, saying that she ought to see the full extent of the property before she decided what to do with it, that it would not be sensible to make any determination about land she had not actually walked. Julia agreed with the sensibleness of this argument and tried not to examine too closely whether the sensibleness was the reason she agreed. Those 3 days were among the most vivid she had ever spent. Daniel showed her the ranch with the thoroughness of a man who loved every part of it, not boastfully, but with the quiet pride of someone who had built and maintained something good and knew its value. He showed her the southern pastures where the cattle grazed, and the northern fields where they put up hay in the summer, the creek with its clear, cold water running over smooth stones, the spring at the base of the hill where the best water came up cold and pure, the viewpoint on the ridge above the barn from which you could see 20 miles on a clear day, the mountains pale blue in the west, and the grassland rolling amber to the east. He was patient with her questions, and she had many of them, about how the cattle were managed and what the financial situation of the ranch was, and what the relationship was between the ranch and the nearest markets for beef. He answered them all with precision, without condescension, and she noticed that he seemed to revise his opinion of her slightly upward each time she asked a question that showed she was thinking practically rather than sentimentally. On the second evening, they sat on the porch after supper in the early dark, the temperature dropping fast as it did in October at that elevation, and watched the stars appear over the grassland in numbers that still astonished Julia after nearly a month in Colorado. She had grown up in the city where the stars were a rumor overhead, dimmed by smoke and gas lamps, and out here they were overwhelming, a full sprawling city of light overhead that made her feel both very small and strangely comforted. "Do you want to keep it?" Daniel asked. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the stars. "I keep asking myself the same question," she said. "And what do you answer yourself?" She thought about it for a moment honestly. "I answer that I don't know how to run a ranch," she said. "I know how to sew and how to manage a household on very little, and I know how to be quiet when things are hard, but I don't know cattle or land management or the economics of livestock or any of the practical things that would be required." "You could learn," he said. It was said simply, without pressure, as a statement of fact. "People learn things at 26. He turned to look at her then, and even in the low light she could see the faint amusement at the corner of his mouth. "I think people learn things at any age if the thing is worth learning," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The porch was quiet around them, the dog lying at the top of the steps like a warm brown shadow, the distant sound of the creek carrying faintly on the cold air. "And would you help me?" she asked. "If I decided to stay, you're already here, you know everything about this place. Would you stay on?" He was quiet for a moment, and she had the impression that he was choosing his words carefully, not because he was uncertain of his feelings, but because he wanted to be fair to her. "I had planned to find work elsewhere," he said. "After you received the deed, it seemed the appropriate thing to give you the place without complication." "That seems lonely," she said before she could stop herself. He looked at her again, and this time the amusement was warmer. "It does," he said, "but I didn't want you to feel that you had inherited a cowboy along with the land. And if I wanted to, she said, and then felt her face go warm because that had not come out the way she had intended it. "I mean, if I wanted your help learning the work, if I asked you to stay on as foreman or manager or whatever the correct term is." "Foreman," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he understood exactly what she had meant and was being very gentlemanly about it. "If you wanted that, I would stay." She looked back at the stars. "Then I'm asking," she said. He was quiet for another moment, then said, "All right." Just all right, simply and without elaboration, and she understood that the word meant something more than its surface. She returned to Millhaven the following morning to attend to practical matters. There was the question of her belongings in Dusty Creek, which required sending a letter to Hattie explaining the situation and asking if Frank could arrange their transport. There was the question of her financial position, which was not strong but which, she was told by the man at the Millhaven Bank, was not impossible either, as the ranch had modest but real assets and a small amount in a ranch account left by Thomas Keller. There was the question of her position as a woman owning property in 1882 in Colorado, which was not legally impossible, since Colorado had granted women's suffrage in 1893, but which was socially complicated in ways that the land agent, the banker, and the general storekeeper each communicated to her through various forms of the same raised eyebrow. Julia had spent her whole life navigating the complications of being a woman in circumstances that were less than straightforward, and she had developed a method for it, which was to be so clear and competent and unruffled in every practical detail that people eventually ran out of reasons to doubt her and moved on to doubting someone else. She applied this method with the same thoroughness that she applied to everything else. She also wrote a letter to Hattie, which was long and detailed, and which Hattie would certainly read to Frank twice over. She described the ranch, described her plan, described Daniel Keller in terms that were professionally neutral and personally compromised by at least 2 sentences that she crossed out before sealing the envelope. The letter she sent said that Daniel Keller was a thorough and knowledgeable man who had been fair and helpful, and who had agreed to stay on as foreman, which was the practical summary. The sentences she crossed out said things about the quality of his eyes in lamplight, and the way the cold air had been between them on the porch, and how she had not been warm since she rode away from the ranch that morning, which was information that she did not think it was useful to send through the U.S. Postal Service. She moved to the ranch on the 1st of November. It was a clear, cold day with frost on the grass, and the sky a brilliant hard blue, and Daniel and Pete both came to meet the wagon. Her belongings did not amount to much. The carpet bag expanded now to a proper trunk that Hattie had pressed upon her as a going-away gift, along with 2 additional wool dresses and a set of curtains for the bedroom window. Daniel carried the trunk upstairs without being asked and set it at the foot of the bed in the whitewashed room his father had prepared, and then stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the way the morning light came through the window onto the bare floor, and said that there was a rag rug in the barn from his mother's time if she wanted it. She said she did. He brought it up that afternoon, and she laid it on the floor in front of the bed, and the room looked suddenly warmer and more like a place where someone lived, and she thought about Margaret Keller making that rug sometime in the years before 1871, weaving it from scraps in the winter evenings, and felt a complicated tenderness that she kept private. The weeks that followed were the hardest and most interesting of her life. Learning to run a ranch was not a graceful process. There were mornings when she was so sore from physical work that she had to sit on the edge of the bed for several minutes before she could stand upright. And there were afternoons when she made decisions that were wrong and had to be corrected. And there were evenings when she sat at the kitchen table with Daniel's account book spread in front of her, and felt the weight of everything she didn't know pressing down on her like the winter sky. But Daniel was patient in a way that she had not encountered before in her dealings with men, which had generally been characterized by either indifference or condescension, and she found herself growing a competency she had not known she could grow, each week bringing skills that the previous week had not possessed. She learned to ride properly rather than the tentative style she had arrived with, learned the names and temperaments of the cattle, learned to read the weather from the clouds and the behavior of the animals, learned the rhythms of the land itself, which was to say the rhythms of water and grass and cold and thaw, and what each one demanded of the people who had agreed to tend it. She also learned Daniel Keller, which was its own education. He was, she came to understand, a man who expressed himself most naturally through action rather than words, not because he was incapable of words, but because he had lived most of his life in a physical world where what you did was the truest version of what you felt. He expressed his opinion of the weather by how he dressed in the morning. He expressed his concern for the cattle by the amount of time he spent checking on them. He expressed his feelings about Julia's presence on the ranch through small, consistent acts of consideration that she noticed without comment, because she had the instinct that calling attention to them would make him uncomfortable. He fixed the latch on her bedroom window without being asked, when he noticed it was stiff from cold. He made sure there was always hot coffee in the morning before she came down, because he rose earlier than she did and understood that the cold was harder for her than for him. When a difficult negotiation with a cattle buyer from Denver left her exhausted and frustrated, he took her for a ride along the creek in the blue late afternoon and did not say anything, just rode beside her while she let the air and the water and the wide sky do the work of restoring her equilibrium. She, in turn, learned the ways in which to show him things without making him self-conscious about receiving them. She kept the house in the order that made his evenings comfortable. She made the meals that she had learned were the ones he ate with satisfaction rather than just for sustenance, a preference that could be observed scientifically if you paid attention, which she did. When she found in the chest in his bedroom closet a collection of his mother's letters, the ones Margaret Keller had received from her family in Kansas City before the correspondence ended, Julia brought them to him at the kitchen table one evening and placed them in front of him without a word, and watched something pass through his face that was grief and relief in equal measure, the grief for the loss that had already happened and the relief that the letters existed and could be touched. "My father kept them," he said. "I know," she said. "They were in the chest in the order she would have arranged them. He kept the order." He looked at her for a moment and she thought he was going to say something, but he only nodded once and picked up the first letter, and she went back to the mending she had brought to the table to give him the privacy of not being observed and the company of not being alone. It was December by then, deep cold settled over the land, and the creek running slowly with ice at the edges. The mountains to the west were fully white, towering and remote, and the nights were long and dark and intimate in the way that winters on isolated ranches are intimate, when the circle of warmth and light inside the house defines the entire world, and the people within it are the whole of human company. They had a rhythm by then, an evening pattern that had established itself without being designed. Supper together, then the account books or the planning discussions or sometimes just reading, Daniel with a newspaper from Millhaven or one of the ranching journals that came through the mail, Julia with the books that Mrs. Oakes at the hotel had pressed upon her when she heard Julia was settling in, and that included a novel by George Eliot and a collection of essays that she had been working through slowly and with great pleasure. One evening in mid-December, Pete Yardley's brother Cal came in from the north pasture looking worried and said that 3 steers had broken through the fence line at the northern boundary and got onto the adjacent property, which belonged to a man named Arthur Marsh, who was not a neighborly character and had on 2 previous occasions made trouble about boundary issues. Daniel pulled on his coat immediately and went out, and Julia, without deliberating, pulled on her own coat and went with him. They found the steers in Marsh's field in the cold blue dusk, 3 rangy longhorns standing in the snow, looking as though they had not quite expected the adventure to turn out this way. Daniel had brought rope and Cal had the fence supplies to repair the break, And they got the steers back without the drama of Arthur Marsh's involvement, because the man's house was half a mile from the boundary, and he apparently had not noticed. Julia helped drive the steers back through the repaired fence gap, riding on the far side with her breath fogging white in the cold and the horse beneath her moving with the brisk efficiency of cold weather work. And when they had gotten the animals back, and the fence was mended, and they rode back toward the house with the full dark settled in and the stars blazing overhead, she was aware of a satisfaction so complete that it surprised her. The bone-deep satisfaction of a physical task accomplished with people you trusted in a place that had become home. Daniel pulled his horse up beside hers when they were within sight of the house lights and said, "You did well." "I've been watching how it's done," she said. "You've been doing it, not just watching," he corrected, and then nudged his horse forward, and she rode after him thinking about the difference between those two things and how it felt to have someone see it accurately. Christmas came with a snowstorm that kept everyone inside for 2 days. Pete and Cal celebrated in the bunkhouse with a bottle of whiskey and a card game that Julia could hear occasionally through the cold, and she and Daniel sat by the fire in the main room with a good lamp and a modest celebration of their own devising, which included the bottle of sweet wine that she had bought in Millhaven in November as a forward-looking gesture, and a supper that she had taken particular care with: roasted chicken and corn bread, and a dried apple pie that had come out better than she had expected. He had given her a gift, which she had not expected at all. It was a small, beautifully made leather journal, the kind of thing a traveling stationer sold, with a brass clasp and fine paper inside. He handed it to her without ceremony after supper, while the fire was burning low and the snow was still falling outside, and when she looked up from it with an expression she could not fully control, he said, "You write things down. I've seen you. Notes in the margins of the account books when you figure something out. I thought you might want somewhere proper to keep them." She held the journal for a moment, pressed it against her chest, and said, "Thank you, Daniel." He looked at her in the firelight, and she could see in his face that the wall of careful professionalism that he had been maintaining since November was under a particular kind of pressure that evening. The wine and the firelight and the 2 days of snow closeness and the gift lying between them had thinned it. "Julia," he said, and stopped. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding something. "I want you to know that when my father did this, when he signed the ranch over, he didn't do it to create an obligation. Not for you and not for me. He wasn't arranging anything." "I know," she said. "I just want to be sure," he said, "that you feel free to make whatever decisions you want to make, about the ranch, about your life. I'm the foreman here. Whatever else I am or am not, that's not a complication to the arrangement unless you say so." She looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow came down in the dark. "Daniel," she said carefully, "what if I want to say so?" The wall came down very quietly. Not all at once, and not dramatically, but in the way that something which has been under pressure for a long time eventually yields, simply and completely. He looked at her, and she saw in his face the full, honest feeling that had been there since November, visible now because he had stopped being so careful about it. "Then I'd say," he said, "that I've been thinking about almost nothing else since the morning you walked up to me in Mrs. Oak's dining room." She laughed softly, and the tension in the room shifted into something warmer. "Almost nothing else," she said. "What was the other thing you were thinking about?" "Whether the north fence would hold through the winter," he said, and she laughed again. And then he reached across and took her hand from where it rested on the cover of the leather journal and held it, and that was enough for the evening and more than she had dared let herself want. The winter deepened into January, and what had begun in that firelit room became a part of the dailiness of the ranch in the way that the most important things do, becoming not less significant but more woven in, part of the fabric of the day rather than separate from it. There was nothing dramatic or improper about it. It was a matter of hands held in the evenings, and a kind of ease that had replaced the careful professionalism, a mutual willingness to let the other person in past the practical boundary into the personal one. He told her things he had not told people, the way she knew he hadn't told people because of how carefully he moved around them, the fact that he had wanted to study in the East once, had been offered a place at an agricultural college in Ohio, and had turned it down because his father's health was failing and the ranch needed him. The way he felt about the injustice of the land policies that had been driving the original peoples from their territories for decades, because he had known an old Arapaho man when he was a boy who had taught him to read the land in ways that no textbook contained, and who had been displaced from land his family had occupied for generations, and the memory of that displacement sat in Daniel like a stone. He did not speak of it with anger exactly, but with the kind of clear-eyed acknowledgement of wrong that comes from people who have thought about something long and honestly. She told him things in return, about the particular quality of loneliness that comes from spending years being competent for other people, doing the necessary work, keeping the household, managing the appearances that needed managing, and never quite having the space to be unknown or uncertain or simply herself without performance. About the way her mother's death had been, in its terrible way, also a releasing, a cutting of the last rope that tied her to the person she had been in Kansas City, and how she had not yet known what she was going to grow into with that freedom, until she had arrived at this place with its deed, and its cold air, and its honest work, and its man with dark eyes, who had told her without hesitation that she could learn things at 26. February brought harder weather and also visitors. A neighbor woman named Clara Brennan rode over from the adjacent ranch to the south one afternoon and introduced herself with the directness of someone accustomed to getting through pleasantries quickly, a woman of perhaps 50 with sharp eyes and a kind face, who said she had heard there was a new owner at the Keller ranch and had come to acquaint herself. She brought a jar of preserved peaches as a visiting gift, sat at Julia's kitchen table, drank 2 cups of coffee, and in the course of the conversation made it very clear that she knew the full situation: Thomas Keller's transfer of the deed, Daniel's staying on, Julia's presence as the new owner, and that her opinion of all of this was that it was about time there was a woman here who knew what she was doing, which Julia found simultaneously flattering and slightly bewildering. When Clara left, Julia repeated the comment to Daniel that evening, and he looked at his coffee cup and said that Clara Brennan had been suggesting for years that the ranch needed a woman's management alongside the cattle work, and that she had apparently said it to Thomas Keller's face on more than one occasion, which his father had received with good humor. Julia said, "Your father sounds like he was a remarkable person." Daniel said, "He was the best man I knew." And there was a quality of love and grief in that sentence that was so simply placed that Julia reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat like that for a while without speaking. March arrived with the first hints of softening, cold still, but with an edge of something coming, the days a little longer and the light a little warmer in the afternoons. The cattle that had wintered through in the northern pasture were beginning to look ahead into spring, and Daniel started talking about the preparations that would be needed for the spring roundup, the additional hands they would hire for the season, the repairs to the equipment, the plans for the cattle drive in late spring to the railhead at Pueblo. There was a problem, which presented itself in the form of a letter from a lawyer in Denver named Edward Coyne, who wrote on behalf of a client named Fletcher Grant, who was, the letter explained, a land speculator and developer who had apparently been interested in acquiring the Keller Creek Ranch property, and who had, according to the letter, reason to believe that the deed transfer to Julia Maddox was not entirely valid. Given that Thomas Keller had been in failing health at the time of the transfer, and that questions might be raised about his capacity to legally execute the document, Julia read the letter twice and then handed it to Daniel without comment. He read it once, set it down, and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father was of entirely sound mind when he signed that deed. The notary is a man named Ellis Prout who has been practicing in Millhaven for 15 years and who will say so. A lawyer in Denver is not afraid of a notary in Millhaven, Julia said. No, Daniel agreed. But he should be afraid of the county judge, who my father knew personally, and who will not enjoy receiving paperwork about a challenge to a notarized deed without very clear grounds. He paused. Fletcher Grant has been trying to buy land in this county for 3 years. He bought out 4 smaller operations to the northeast of Millhaven last year. He builds them up and sells them to Eastern investors. Then he's not going to stop at one letter, Julia said. Probably not, Daniel agreed. Then we had better be ready, she said. They went to Millhaven together the following week. The lawyer they consulted was a local man named Amos Dean, who was plain-spoken and thorough, and who examined the deed, examined the letter from Coyne, consulted his records, and said that he was confident the transfer would hold, but that they should be prepared for the challenge to come formally through the county court, which meant gathering evidence of Thomas Keller's mental competency at the time of signing, which meant affidavits from the notary, from the doctor who had attended Thomas in his final months, and from any other individuals who had witnessed his clarity of mind and purpose. Daniel spent the next 2 weeks collecting those affidavits. The notary Ellis Prout gave his without hesitation. The doctor, a man named Dr. Hale, wrote a careful and thorough account of Thomas Keller's cognitive state, which he described as entirely intact until the very end, the illness being physical and not mental in its effects. Clara Brennan wrote an affidavit that was more characterful than strictly legal, but that communicated with absolute clarity that Thomas Keller had been a deliberate and competent man who knew precisely what he was doing at all times, and that anyone suggesting otherwise was either mistaken or dishonest, and that she was prepared to say so to any judge in the state of Colorado. The formal challenge came in April. Fletcher Grant's lawyer filed a petition in county court in Millhaven, and the case was set for a hearing in June. Julia continued running the ranch through all of it with the same thoroughness she had been developing since November, because the cattle did not care about legal proceedings, and the work of the land continued regardless of what was happening in the courthouse. She was also aware of something she had been aware of since February, but had been allowing herself to simply inhabit rather than analyze, which was that the question of her future and Daniel's future on this ranch were not separate questions. They had not spoken directly about this, but it was present in the way that undiscussed things are present when 2 people are honest with themselves, visible in the small daily choices, in the way he deferred to her on decisions about the ranch without it being a diminishment of his own judgment but a recognition of her authority, and in the way she sought his counsel on everything without it being a diminishment of her own. One evening in late April, when the spring was properly arrived and the grassland had turned green and the creek was running full and cold with snowmelt, they walked down to the water after supper. The evening was warm enough to be out without coats for the first time in months, and the sky was the particular deep soft blue of a spring evening, the first stars just appearing above the mountains. They stood at the edge of the creek and watched it go by. The water was clear and the creek bed was smooth stone, and the sound it made was one of the best sounds Julia had known in her life. "I want to tell you something," Daniel said. She waited. "I want to be clear about something I haven't been entirely clear about," he said, "which is that I am in love with you." He said it the way he said most important things, simply and without preamble, looking at the water rather than at her. But then he turned to look at her when he had said it. "I have been since I think before Christmas, and very likely before that, and I should have said so directly rather than letting it exist as a thing we both understood without it being spoken." Julia looked at him in the blue evening light and felt something settle in her chest that had been in motion for months, something that had been moving toward this and now arrived and rested. "I am in love with you too," she said, with equal directness, because directness was a gift you gave a man who valued it. And I have also been failing to say so clearly for longer than was necessary." He put his hand to her face, just his palm against her cheek, very gently, and she leaned into it in the way you lean into warmth when you are cold, and he kissed her beside the creek in the spring evening while the water went by below them, and the first stars appeared properly in the sky. May passed in a state of happiness that was different from anything Julia had experienced before, not the happiness of ease or good fortune, but the happiness of rightness, of being in a place and with a person that fit the shape of who she was. She worked harder than she had ever worked in her life and felt better than she ever had. The spring cattle work was grueling and satisfying, and she took a full role in it, which surprised the two seasonal hands they had hired for the roundup, men who had not expected the owner of the ranch to work alongside them, but who revised their expectations when they saw that she was competent and did not ask them to do things she was not willing to do herself. Daniel watched her with the seasonal hands with an expression that she caught once or twice in the course of the roundup, an expression of plain, uncomplicated pride, and she carried that with her the way you carry a good thing. The court hearing was in the second week of June. Julia and Daniel and Amos Dean drove to Millhaven early that morning and sat in the county courthouse, which was a modest but dignified building, and waited while the judge, a heavy-set man named Judge Calloway, went through the documents. Fletcher Grant was there himself, with his Denver lawyer beside him, a well-dressed man with an air of metropolitan superiority that did not appear to impress Judge Calloway, who had been administering frontier law for 18 years and had a settled view of people who brought paperwork to his court, expecting it to replace common sense. The hearing lasted the better part of a day. Coyne argued that Thomas Keller's health had compromised his judgment. Amos Dean presented the affidavits from the notary, the doctor, and Clara Brennan, whose contribution Judge Calloway read with what appeared to be suppressed amusement. Daniel was called to testify about his father's state of mind in the months leading up to the deed transfer, and he did so with the same calm directness he brought to everything, describing without drama or embellishment the conversations he had had with his father about the Maddox connection, about Margaret Keller's family, about the old grievance his father had carried for years, and about the deliberate, considered nature of his father's decision to make this particular transfer. Julia was called to testify about how she had received the deed and how she had responded to it. She described going to the land office in Dusty Creek, coming to Millhaven, learning the history, going to the ranch. The judge asked her whether she had known Thomas Keller or had any prior relationship with him. She said no. The judge asked whether she believed the transfer had been a mistake. She looked at the judge for a moment and then said, simply, no. She believed the man had known exactly what he was doing. The judge dismissed the challenge the following morning, ruling that the deed transfer was valid in all respects, and that the petitioner had failed to establish grounds to question Thomas Keller's competency at the time of execution. Fletcher Grant's expression when the ruling came down was the expression of a man who had not expected to lose and was going to need some time to accept it. His lawyer was already gathering papers and moving toward the door before the judge had finished speaking. Julia stood on the steps of the courthouse in the June sun and felt as though someone had removed a weight from her shoulders that she had been carrying since April without being entirely aware of how heavy it was. Daniel stood beside her and she turned to him and said, "It was always going to be mine, wasn't it? This time it was not a question." He looked at her with the expression that she had come to know was his version of his heart being entirely visible, the one he only showed her, the one that contained everything. "It was always meant for you," he said. She felt the words settle into her the way a key settles into the lock it was made for. She had thought, when she first opened that envelope in her rented room above Hargrove's General Store, that it was a mistake, that someone had addressed the wrong Julia, put the wrong name on the wrong document, sent a stranger's inheritance to the wrong pair of hands. She had thought it with such certainty. And it had taken this ranch, and this winter, and this man, and this spring, and this day in front of this courthouse, to understand that Thomas Keller had been precise and deliberate in all things, and that when he had written her name on that deed, he had meant to write her name on that deed, and that the word mistake had nothing to do with any of it. They rode back to the ranch that afternoon in an ease that was complete and undivided. Pete Yardley, who had heard the news from Cal, who had ridden to Millhaven earlier in the day to find out the result, met them in the yard with a face so pleased that his mustache appeared to have expanded, and said that the occasion called for supper that was not the usual, and produced from the back of the barn a ham that he had apparently been saving for a significant event, which Julia found both touching and entirely characteristic of Pete. The supper that evening was one of the best Julia had known, simple food prepared with care and eaten in the company of people who had become, over the months, something like family. Pete and Cal ate with them at the main table rather than the bunkhouse, which was an exception to the usual arrangement, and understood by everyone present to be the right exception for this occasion. And there was cider and the ham and corn bread, and a dried apple pie that had become Julia's signature contribution to the household's culinary life. And there was conversation that moved easily between the practical and the personal. The way conversation moves in a table full of people who have worked hard together and trust one another. After supper, when Pete and Cal had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean and the lamp was burning low on the table, Daniel said to Julia, "I'd like to ask you something." She looked at him across the table. He said, "I'd like to ask you to marry me, if you're willing." Not because of the ranch or the arrangement or any of the complications, but because I can't imagine the rest of my life being anything other than what the last 7 months have been. And because you are the most extraordinary person I have ever met, and because I love you in a way that I don't have better words for, though I've been attempting to find them since approximately November. She looked at him for a long moment, at the honest, steady face and the dark eyes and the hands that were folded on the table with that characteristic deliberate stillness, and felt something so large and so quiet rise in her that she could not speak for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Daniel, yes. Of course, yes." He smiled, and it was a smile she had been watching grow since November from something careful to something full, and now it was complete and it made the lamplight seem brighter. They were married in August of 1883, in the small church in Millhaven that had a good minister named Reverend Hadley, who married them on a Thursday morning with Hattie and Frank in attendance, Frank having made the journey from Dusty Creek with the children and a look of satisfied approval, and Clara Brennan sitting in the front pew beside the minister's wife, with the air of a woman who has been right about something all along, and is not even slightly surprised by the outcome. Pete Yardley wept, which he afterward attributed to a piece of dust that had gotten into his eyes at an inconvenient moment, and which no one in attendance believed. The wedding was simple and right. Julia wore a dress of ivory wool that she had made herself over the preceding weeks, a decision that had seemed practical and turned out to be a pleasure, every stitch going in with the awareness of what the dress was for, and she had never made anything with more care. Daniel wore his best suit, which Clara Brennan had apparently informed him needed pressing, so it was pressed, and he stood at the front of the church looking at Julia when she came down the aisle with the expression she had come to understand was the truest version of him, open and warm, and entirely without the protective reserve that other people received from him. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, and they meant every word, the depth of which was communicated not in the volume with which they were said, but in the quality of attention each gave the other in the saying, as though the words were being measured and found to be the right size for what was actually being promised. Afterward, there was a supper at the hotel that Mrs. Oakes had laid out with what she clearly considered appropriate pomp, and there were toasts, including one from Frank that was so warmly gruff and slightly incoherent with affection that Hattie had to take his elbow and murmur something to him to bring it to an end. and one from Clara Brennan that was crisp and perfect and made several people at the table laugh. Hattie held Julia's hands in the hotel corridor before they left and said, "Your mother would have loved him." Julia held Hattie's hands back and said, "I know, I think she knows." Hattie looked at her with eyes that were bright and said, "You look like yourself, Julia, more than you ever have." Julia thought about this on the ride back to the ranch that evening, sitting close to Daniel on the wagon seat, while the August night spread enormous overhead, and the grassland was dark and full on either side, the stars brilliant and the air warm and scented with late summer grass. And she thought that Hattie was right. She did feel like herself more completely than she ever had, as though the years before Colorado had been a sketch, and this was the full picture. The autumn that followed was golden and plentiful. The cattle drive to Pueblo in September went well, better than the previous year according to Daniel's careful accounting, and the price they got for their beef was fair. Julia had developed by then a full working relationship with the ranch's operations that was genuinely equal to Daniel's in certain areas, specifically the financial management and planning, and complementary in others. And the combination worked the way that combinations work when two people are honest about their respective capabilities and have the security to appreciate rather than compete with the other's strengths. She also continued to cultivate relationships with the neighboring ranches and with the broader community of Millhaven, which was something that Daniel acknowledged was important and that he was less natural at than she was. She had a quality of entering a room or a conversation and making the other person feel that she was genuinely interested in them, which she was. It was not a performance, and this quality served the ranch well in the negotiations and social relationships that were part of sustaining a working operation in a community. The winters were long and intimate and full of small daily richness. They read to each other in the evenings. They argued sometimes about the accounts and occasionally about the management decisions, and once significantly about whether to take on a third seasonal hand for the spring, an argument that went back and forth with genuine heat, until they arrived at the same conclusion from different sides and recognized each other's thinking in the conclusion and laughed about it. The arguments were clean, which is to say they were about things and not about feelings, and they ended in the resolution they were aimed at rather than in lingering resentment. In the winter of 1884, Julia discovered she was expecting a child. She told Daniel on a January evening simply, without extensive preamble, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the snow falling outside and the lamp burning between them, and watching his face receive the news was one of the finest moments she had experienced. The way the careful equilibrium of his expression broke open into something completely undefended, something that was pure joy without any of the composure he normally maintained around strong feeling. He was around the table before she had time to register that he had moved, and he put his arms around her and held her, and she held him back, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed to be said and a great deal that could be felt without language. The pregnancy progressed through the winter and into the spring of 1884. Julia continued working the ranch through most of it, adjusting what she did as her body required, with Daniel exercising a vigilance over her welfare that was occasionally slightly more than necessary, but always came from a place she could not reasonably resent. She told him this one morning, and he said that he understood and would try to moderate it. He did try, though not always successfully. Clara Brennan came and went through those months with an increasing frequency that communicated a personal investment in the proceedings, arriving with preserved food and practical advice, and the steady presence of a woman who had survived her own difficult seasons and was prepared to help someone she cared about through theirs. In the early morning of June 7, 1884, with the spring fully arrived and the grassland green and the creek running clear below the property, Julia delivered a boy. He was healthy and large, and announced his arrival with a conviction that was audible from the yard, where Pete Yardley received the news by removing his hat and holding it to his chest with an expression of great solemnity. Daniel, who had been in the room for the birth in a way that some people found unusual but that the doctor, who was a practical man named Dr. Hale, found sensible, sat on the edge of the bed afterward with his son in his arms, and a look on his face that Julia thought she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. The same openness that had been on his face in January when she had told him, but deeper now, tempered and made more permanent by the reality of the small person in his arms. They named him Thomas, for Daniel's father. Julia's middle name was Eleanor, and so the boy was Thomas Daniel Keller, which had the names of two people who could not be present but who were in the room in the only way available to the absent, which was through the love and the choices of the people who remained. Thomas was a determined and cheerful infant who progressed through his first months with the confidence of someone who had decided that the world was a satisfactory place, and he intended to make full use of it. He was placed in the cradle that Daniel had built in the weeks before the birth, working on it in the barn in the evenings with a level of carpentry that exceeded anything strictly necessary, and that Julia had not previously known he possessed, and the cradle became an object of some note on subsequent visits from Clara and Hattie, who had made the journey again for the birth. Hattie held Thomas with the ease of a woman who had two children of her own and cooed at him with absolute sincerity, and then looked up at Julia and said, "He has Daniel's eyes." Julia looked at her son and at the dark, quiet eyes that were already beginning to settle into the color they would be, and said yes, he did. Hattie handed Thomas to Daniel and watched the two of them together with the expression of a woman who is witnessing something that makes the world seem better than it sometimes appears, and then wiped the corner of her eye in a businesslike way and went to help Clara in the kitchen, because there was always something to be done. The years that followed were the years in which the Keller Creek Ranch became what it fully was, which was to say a place that had always had good land and good cattle and good work, and that had gained something additional in the persons of Julia and Daniel and Thomas, and in due time, others. A daughter came in 1886, a small, alert girl they named Eleanor Margaret, Eleanor for Julia's middle name and the inheritance she wanted to acknowledge, and Margaret for the woman who had been Margaret Maddox, and then Margaret Keller, and whose rug was still on the floor of the upstairs bedroom, and whose china plates were still arranged on the shelf in the main room, and whose letters were kept in their careful order in the chest in the closet. A woman they kept present in the small conscious choices of the household, because the people who love the people who are gone do that. Eleanor was a different temperament than Thomas, quieter and more observant, the kind of child who watched everything before acting on it, and who at 3 years old had already identified Pete Yardley as the person on the ranch most susceptible to being persuaded by large eyes and an innocent expression, which she applied with the systematic thoroughness of a born negotiator. The ranch grew through those years. A second cattle herd of a different breed for a different market, a decision that Julia had researched in the agricultural journals and proposed to Daniel with a full financial argument, and a plan for the phased implementation that he had read carefully, asked 3 specific questions about, and then said yes to. An expansion of the barn to accommodate the additional animals, a proper root cellar and a cold storage structure that made the winters more manageable. A kitchen garden that Julia had been developing since her first spring on the land, and that had grown from a modest patch to a serious enterprise that fed the household through much of the year, and provided surplus that she sold in Millhaven. In 1888, a second son arrived, quieter at birth than Thomas had been, and with Julia's gray eyes and a thoughtful expression that Daniel said he had seen on Julia approximately 4,000 times, and that felt like meeting someone familiar. They named him James, and he was a child who in due time revealed a fascination with animals of every kind, beginning with the ranch dog's puppies, and expanding outward in a systematic survey of everything that moved on the property, which created certain challenges in the mornings when the chickens needed to be let out, and James needed to be intercepted before he attempted to conduct experiments on them. Pete Yardley, who was by this point as much a fixture of the family as a fixture of the ranch, taught Thomas and Alina to ride with the same patience he had applied to everything for 20 years, and took a particular pride in their developing competency that he communicated not through praise, but through the increasing difficulty of the things he let them try, which was, Julia understood, Pete's highest form of compliment. Cal Yardley had married in 1885, a woman from Millhaven named Ruth who had a practical disposition and a fondness for the cattle that Cal found deeply pleasing, and who became a regular presence on the ranch in ways that gradually made the arrangement more communal and less strictly employer and employee, which suited everyone. The question of Thomas Keller's intentions, which had been the great mystery of Julia's life in November of 1882, had long since resolved itself into understanding. She thought sometimes about the man she had never met, the careful, deliberate man who had spent his last months making sure that the ranch would find its way to a Maddox, to Margaret's family, to make right the thing that had not been right for 11 years. She thought about what it must have cost him to arrange it, not financially but emotionally, to take the land that his son had grown up on and worked and loved and assign it outright to a stranger, trusting that the stranger would be the right person and that his son would understand. She thought he must have known Daniel very well to trust that Daniel would not be diminished by it but completed by it, which was in fact what had happened. On the 25th anniversary of her arrival at the ranch, which they calculated as the 1st of November 1907, the family gathered on the porch in the cool autumn evening. Thomas was 23 by then, a broad-shouldered young man with his father's directness and his mother's tenacity, who had been working the ranch full-time since graduating from the agricultural college in Fort Collins the previous spring, a detail that pleased Daniel for reasons he had never fully articulated, but that Julia understood in the shape of the thought his father had once given up on. Alina was 21 and living in Denver, working at a newspaper as a typesetter and contributing pieces under her own name about the history of the ranch country, a career that she had pursued with the systematic determination that had always been characteristic of her, and that her parents supported with a completeness that was not universally considered appropriate by their neighbors, but that was entirely consistent with who Julia and Daniel Keller were. James was 19 and still on the ranch, still in the business of understanding animals, but with a direction now that had become veterinary medicine, which he was studying through correspondence courses while working the land. They sat on the porch as the sun went down over the grassland, the mountains still visible in the west in the last of the light, blue and enormous and permanent. Pete Yardley was there, older now and somewhat slower but still on the property, and still the most reliable man Daniel had ever known. Clara Brennan had died 2 years ago at the age of 71, a loss that was still felt, but she was the kind of person who leaves behind something that stays, and her practical wisdom was quoted regularly at the Keller kitchen table. Hattie and Frank had moved to Millhaven in 1895, when Frank retired from his blacksmith work due to a shoulder injury, and they had been a fixed part of the community's life since then, regular visitors to the ranch, and the people most thoroughly informed of all developments therein. Julia looked at the grassland in the evening light. 25 years of this land and this sky and this work and these people. 25 years since she had stood in a rented room above a general store and opened an envelope addressed in a dead man's careful hand and found inside something she had thought was a mistake. Daniel was beside her, as he always was in the evenings, and she turned to look at him as the last light faded from the mountains. His hair was gray at the temples now, and the lines of his face had deepened into the map of a life of outdoor work and genuine living, and he was the most beautiful person she had ever seen, which was not a matter of the gray or the lines, but of the way the person who inhabited that face had not changed in any essential way since the morning in Mrs. Oak's dining room, when he had taken the envelope she offered him, and looked at it with that complicated recognition and said, "Will you sit down?" "What are you thinking?" he said, because he still asked that 25 years in, because the answers were still interesting to him. She looked back at the grassland. "I'm thinking about that envelope," she said, "and how certain I was it was a mistake." He was quiet for a moment. And now, she thought about Thomas Keller, who she had never met, who had addressed an envelope in careful handwriting to a stranger and sent along 6 words of instruction and a deliberate gift. She thought about the morning she had ridden out to the ranch for the first time in Daniel's wagon and set her boots on this ground and felt the thing she had felt. That word that she had not known how to name immediately but had come to understand was a simple and essential recognition: home. She thought about the creek and the mountains and the cattle and the cold, clear water and the rug on the bedroom floor and the china plates and the letters in their careful order and the children and the years and the man beside her who was the context in which all of it was possible. "Now I think," she said, "that he knew exactly what he was doing." Daniel reached out and took her hand on the porch railing, his fingers wrapping around hers in the way they had wrapped around hers for 24 years, with the ease of something entirely natural, something as right and unremarkable and essential as water running south in the creek below the property line. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched the evening come fully in over the Keller Creek Ranch, the sky turning from gold to deep blue to the first dark out of which the stars began to appear, one by one, and then all at once, in the enormous numbers that had never stopped astonishing her, scattered overhead like proof of something, like light applied to darkness with the thoroughness of someone who believed the darkness deserved no quarter. Thomas came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to each of them, and then stood at the railing looking at the same sky. "Good evening," he said, which was a characteristic understatement for what the evening clearly was. "Your grandfather built this porch," Daniel said. It was something he had said before, but he said it again because it was true, and because it was the kind of thing worth saying again, that the thing you were standing on had been built by someone who had believed it would be stood on, that the past was present in the particular form of the useful things the past had made and left behind. Thomas looked at the porch boards and then at his father and then at his mother and said, "Then he built it well." "He did," Julia said. And she meant the porch, and she meant all of it, the land and the deed and the 6 careful words, and the name written in a deliberate hand on an envelope that had arrived on a Tuesday morning in October of 1882, and changed everything, which was to say, she meant the long consequential chain of this man's choices that had led to this porch, and this evening, and these people standing on the ground of the life that had been made here. James came out next, and then a leaner who had ridden in that afternoon from the stage at Millhaven, and the family gathered on the porch in the dark as it came fully in, not because they had planned to gather, but because the porch in the evening was where you went when you wanted to be together, and they wanted to be together. And the grassland lay quiet and enormous around them, and the stars burned overhead, and the creek ran cold and clear along the southern boundary, and the mountain stood in the west like a fact, and the Keller Creek Ranch held all of it, the living and the memory of the living and the work and the love and the long improbable grace of a life built well on ground that was, as it had always been, exactly where it was meant to be. She had thought it was a mistake. She had held that envelope and looked at her own name written by a hand she didn't know and been so certain of the error, and the certainty had made complete sense from where she was standing, a woman with $12 and a carpetbag and a grief still fresh and a future that was entirely unmapped. She had not had any way to see from there what she could see from here, which was that Thomas Keller had been the least mistaken of any of them, that what looked like an inexplicable random kindness was in fact an act of extraordinary precision, a thing aimed across years and distance at exactly the person and the place and the moment it was intended for. She held Daniel's hand on the porch railing and watched the stars, and thought that some things that look like accidents are the opposite of accidents. That some things arrive looking like strangers and turn out to be the return of something that was always yours. That a deed to a ranch in a county you have barely visited can be the thing that your whole life was tending toward, without your knowing it, the way water tends toward the creek without planning to, following the shape of the land, finding what is low and true. The lamp in the house window threw a warm rectangle of light across the porch floor. Inside, Ruth and Cal were in the kitchen, and their voices carried out through the evening air, companionable and familiar. Pete Yardley was in the bunkhouse with the lamp still on. The ranch dog, old now but still authoritative, was lying at the top of the porch steps with the permanent satisfaction of an animal that has lived well on good ground. Everything was where it was meant to be. Julia Maddox Keller stood on the porch of the ranch that had been given to her with love across the long reach of a dying man's conscience, and held the hand of the man she loved in the cool October night. 25 years to the month from the morning, she had ridden out this road for the first time not knowing what she was riding toward, and she felt the satisfaction of a life that had been met with the full weight of herself. And the deep certainty that ran beneath everything like the creek ran beneath the southern property line, clear and constant and sure of its course. It was always meant for her. She understood that now, in her bones and in the ground beneath her feet and in the hand that held hers in the dark. It had always been meant for her, and she was glad with a gladness that went all the way down, that she had opened the envelope and gotten on the wagon and set her boots on this ground and stayed.